Well, welcome to this launch event for Outcast. Outcast is the proper one, by Louise, Carey. Very excited. Inscape was one of our favorite books last year, so very excited for Outcast, the sequel. It's officially out tomorrow. So I don't expect any of you to have read it yet. I will let you off. There will not be a quiz at the end of this. And we are going to try and keep the conversation spoiler-free. For those of you that haven't read Inscape yet, or Outcast, or indeed any of Mike Carey's books, which is the Rampart series. My name is Anne Landman. I am the Festival Director of Chimera, Scotland's Festival of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror Writing. And I don't usually get to chat to people during the festival because I'm too busy trying to coordinate things, basically. This is very valuable things to know about. If you want to run a festival, you don't get to do any of the fun things like chatting to the authors that you love. You just run about, make sure everyone has water on the table. Or in the case of our last two festivals, which were fully digital, you make sure people have turned their cameras on. So I am so excited. And I talk really fast, I apologize, because I'm excited. So I'm super excited to be chatting to Louise and Mike today. And they are indeed 2/3, 2/4 of the Carey family. They're definitely 2/3 of the Carey writing family, which we will talk about later. We are mainly going to talk about Dystopias today. We're going to seek into a bit of RPGing later, because I have actually played with Louise and I have watched Mike play. And they're just brilliant role-play game players. So we're probably going to chat about that. If you guys at any point have a question, just shove it in the Q&A for us. It's the one next to the chat. And you can, just pop them in there. Just pop them in at any point during the event and we'll sneak them in where and when appropriate. We're going to talk about writing, we're going to talk about the books in as vague a fashion as we can. And yeah, just fire your questions in. So yes, we're going to talk about dystopias. So I'm going to open with the most obvious question, which is, why would you write dystopias? Dystopias are horrible places where horrible things happen to potentially nice people. Why not write a utopia or just write a nice romance novel, which we were discussing earlier? Why write a dystopia? And we're going to start with Mike.
I think there are lots of different reasons, especially you sort of wrote in post-apocalyptic fiction as well. I mean, the Carey novels, I think, are Rampart Trilogy, are not really dystopian in tone. They're set in a world that has fallen apart and is sort of painfully putting itself back together again. And in some
I
way,
hate to break it to you, that is the definition of dystopia. A world that has fallen apart is the definition of dystopia.
I think a lot of dystopias, a lot of near future dystopias are set on the brink of things falling apart. And actually, in some ways, I think they're often about things not falling apart enough. They're about situations where there is repressive control, where freedoms have become narrower, where people are trapped in sort of very much repressive and suboptimal systems. Whereas I think apocalyptic fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction, like in the Rampart Trilogy, it's sort of exploring a different stage in what might be the same process. I think a lot of dystopias are are very, very serious in intent, whereas a lot of the post-apocalyptic fiction can be just silly fun, like the Mad Max movies, for example. Dystopias tend to take a trend in contemporary society and tease it out, explore where it might lead to. So they can be thought experiments. They can be grim warnings, as the Handmaid's Tale is, looking at a trend in modern political life and seeing where it might go. I think that there are lots and lots of different reasons, and I just think it's an incredibly powerful fictional tool, really.
Louise, is it the same for you?
I think the short answer for me would be that I think I write dystopian fiction because we live in dystopian times. I think we're sort of living at a time of such uncertainty and anxiety about so many things, climate change, the global pandemic. When I was writing Inscape, the first one in the trilogy, it was just during the time that the Cambridge Analytica scandal was breaking. So we had the fears about sort of big tech sort of encroaching on national politics and swaying public opinion in ways that were really sort of irresponsible and sometimes corrupt. I think when you're living in such a time of uncertainty, it sort of maybe drives people in two opposing directions. Either you write things that are really comforting and escapist, or you write things that are sort of tending towards exploring those dark anxieties about where society is headed.
Yeah.
I think both are really important, but
they can definitely be ways of picking at the scab, can't they?
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your dystopia, or in Mike's case, your post-apocalyptic setting. So Louise, you've already mentioned a bit of where Inscape was possibly coming from. So tell us about the world of Inscape and Outcast.
Yeah, so the Inscape Trilogy is it's a series of cyberpunk thrillers set in a futuristic society where democracies have collapsed and corporations now run the world. So the setting for both Inscape and Outcast is a sort of futuristic London that's now divided along the riverbank of what was formerly the Thames, and is owned by two major tech corporations. So Intech on one side of the riverbed and Thoughtfront on the other. And these two big tech corporations are sort of jockeying for power and using all the resources at their disposal to kind of gain supremacy in this Cold War. Not least of these resources is people. So my protagonist Tanta is a ward of Intech. So she's an orphan taken in by the corporation and raised since birth to be the perfect corporate spy. Inscape follows her first case. She's paired with a neuroengineer with a dark past called Cole, and they're trying to sort of crack the case of like an act of very violent and bloody cyber terrorism. Outcast, without trying to head into spoiler territory, but Outcast continues to explore that same world while also sort of widening the setting from the city to the sort of the more post-apocalyptic wasteland that surrounds it, and following the lives of the characters sort of stranded in that no man's land.
Brilliant. Mike, the Coley series.
Yeah, the Rampart trilogy. It's set in a world about 200 years from now. It's a world that has experienced complete climate collapse. It's come out the other side of that process, but it's also been inflected by humanity's sort of last desperate attempts to stave off climate collapse. The scientific interventions, the geoengineering that was meant to sort of keep things together for a little bit longer. So in Coley's world, they did all the stuff that's just being sort of like floated as blue sky projects at the moment, like they seeded the upper atmosphere with reflective substances to bounce some of the heat back into space. They seeded the ocean with algae blooms to sort of lock some of the carbon into the ocean depths. And then they also tried to deal with deforestation by genetic engineering. So they made trees that would grow incredibly quickly and would seek out nourishment wherever it was to be found. As a result of this, Coley now lives in a world where there are very, very few people left. They live in isolated communities surrounded by dense woodland, which is feral and cannibalistic. It will attack humans and eat them if they go into the forest. The only saving grace to all of this is that they're still heliotropic. All of the trees' movements are still fueled by sunlight. They'll move towards nutrition, but they can only do it while the sun is shining. On overcast days, you can venture out. There's very little technology left, but Coley manages to get his hands on one piece of tech. He hopes it's a weapon. This is a world where possession of technology gives you access to, it makes you part of the elite. it takes you up to the sort of like upper echelons of society. So Coley actually steals a piece of tech which he hopes will be something like a gun, something that will sort of cement his status in myth and mood, the village where he lives. Unfortunately, it's not. It's a music player. It's a media player, which is inhabited by an AI, the sampled consciousness of a dead Japanese pop star. So the books are partly about that relationship. It's also about what happens to Cody when he's exiled from his village and thrown out into this incredibly hostile world, and begins to explore it and begins to come to terms both with what it is and how it came to be. And discovering his own world, he discovers ours as well.
I'm so glad that there's no sunshine in Scotland, so we'd be perfectly safe from all these trees that you're talking about. So those are two very different worlds, and they're both versions of a future that I'm not entirely sure I want to live in. So when you sat down to start writing these books, did you start with the setting? Did you have a picture of this world in your mind, or did you start with a character or with a particular theme you wanted to talk about and you created the world around it? Let's start with Mike.
In this instance, I did start with the character, with Coley. In fact, Coley predates the novels. There was a short story, very, very different from the Rampart trilogy, called All That's Red Earth. It's not even science fiction. It's a fantasy story. It has magic instead of technology, but it has a narrative voice that is Coley's. And part of the attraction initially was in that voice, in trying to write a kind of a story seen through the lens of the character who's very literate, who comes to reading and writing very late in life and uses language in a very sort of rough-hewn, imperfect way. Coley's language, one of the inspirations was Huckleberry Finn. I wanted a narrative voice that was that kind of rough, but with its own sort of inherent poetry to it. And I literally built the world around Coley and around the sort of my own obsessions, which, as Lou was saying earlier, arise from the weird situation that we find ourselves in now. The sort of the terrifying imminence of the edge of the catastrophe curve. So I just dropped Coley into that world and wrote it to see what would happen.
Brilliant. And he does have a wonderful voice. Just from the opening of the book, Coley, he just draws you in and you just want to, oh, poor boy. Poor boy. You're a terrible man. Sorry, that was a spoiler. Were we expecting happy things? Apologies for our attendees. Were you expecting
happy things?
Kittens. That's RJ Barker, sorry. Lou, what about the World of Inscape?
It's interestingly different for me. I think Inscape began with thoughts about futuristic technology and futuristic societies rather than starting from a character. The sort of the idea that began it all is quite a commonplace idea, really. I was just thinking about what it would be like if people could access the internet through their minds, which is sort of, something that I've encountered in other fictions before. But having that idea at the time that I did, at a time when there were so many concerns beginning to be circulated about the influence of social media, the power of the algorithm, that thought soon morphed into a darker question of how would it change us as people if we had those powerful algorithms inside our heads all the time and we couldn't switch them off? What would that do to our sense of identity and the things that we thought were important? And that was sort of how the World of Inscape began. It was a short step from there to what would it be like if big tech really had sort of the power of governments as well as the power to sort of curate our news feeds and our social lives. What if it also sort of got to decide who lived and who died and what we all did? And that's how the sort of the dystopian sort of society of the Inscape series was born for me. And the characters kind of came later, though I think that really sort of with ideas like this, what's sort of so compelling for me is how that power of big tech and how those sort of the insidious kind of power of algorithms interacts on a human level. So Tanta and Cole, the two sort of protagonists who are at the heart of the first book, the effect that this like big tech dystopia has on them and their sense of self and how they relate to the world and to each other, that was really, really sort of central to it.
And did you, I mean, I know you're a fiction writer, so this is all made up, but did you go out and look into research into that kind of technology or the interaction, like driverless cars, that kind of?
So my background's in psychology, or partly. I did a master's in psychology that I was actually doing around the same time that I was planning the initial idea for Inscape. So I came at it more from the direction of what impact is this going to have on the human psyche, rather than from the sort of tech perspective. But I was thinking a lot about psychological theories, especially sort of early, like sort of developmental psychology, so studies about how people grow up and what makes for healthy childhood development. And I was sort of thinking how, because one thing I think we ask ourselves a lot now, as we're sort of getting generations of children growing up with smartphones, is what impact is that going to have on child development? And that's something that we're kind of just finding out. We don't really know yet, and it's a really interesting question, especially when like so many sort of social media algorithms that are designed to be addictive and to keep you coming back for more. I was really struck when I was planning the book by an article I read where they were interviewing some sort of CEOs of large social media companies who were all saying that they never let their children have access to the algorithms that they have helped to design and the social media apps that they are promoting. You know, it's sort of like, yeah, yes, I have built this thing and I have become a billionaire because of it, but good God, I would never let my children near it. Like, I'm not a sociopath. Which really struck me. It's sort of like, you know, the people who know the most about the apps are sometimes the people who are frightened to let them into their own lives because they know that they might have a really deleterious effect on their kids' well-being.
It's interesting, isn't it, how the lockdowns and the pandemic have sort of made neuroplasticity a really urgent topic, because everybody has been sort of like really powerfully affected, I think, by having 2 years of like their social interactions completely disrupted, their behavioural repertoires savagely limited. That's not something you can just shake off instantly.
Do you feel that science fiction is no longer fiction? It's science reality now. Some of it.
I think science fiction has always been about reality. Which is not to say it doesn't have escapist strands in it, but you know, as actually Le Guin said, people who don't read science fiction or watch science fiction often make the mistake of thinking it's just about excursions outwards, whereas most science fiction is incursions inwards. It looks at where we are now and who we are now, and it's got, you know, one of the most impressive toolkits for posing and answering those questions.
Does that sometimes spur you when you sit down to write these books, both of yours? Are you frightening yourself of the future that you see in them?
I think looking at where my stories start, I almost never set out to deal with serious themes. So yeah, I start with, I just love storytelling. So I usually start with an idea for a story. It was unusual to start with a character, which I did with Carey, and I also did with Girl with All the Gifts. Mostly I start with the plot of it, and I sort of work outwards from that. But I think it's inevitable that your worldview will soak through into what you write. Wherever you start from, you end up dealing with your own demons, your own sort of bugbears.
And I think sometimes that sort of creeps up on you, doesn't it? Because it's very similar to me when I wrote Inscape. Obviously, these ideas about big tech and sort of the power of the algorithm, these were all percolating in the back of my mind. But it wasn't like I sat down and I was like, I'm going to write a book that's going to be about big tech and, like, you know, overreach of the algorithm, and it's going to be really deep. I thought, you know, it was the plot for me. I sort of, I set out to write an exciting thriller with action scenes and sort of a compelling central relationship and all of that good stuff. And the other stuff, the sort of the thematic things kind of seeped into that. And to a certain extent, I think crept up on me. I don't know if this happens to you, Dad, but like the more I think about Inscape, the more I think, oh yeah, I suppose that was in there as well. Wasn't really sort of aware of it being in there, but I suppose it was.
Yes.
Sort of, it creeps up.
And then it's fascinating sometimes, isn't it, when you read reviews of your own work, you think, oh, so I was talking about that, wasn't I? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's why it's often useless asking an author what was this book about, because they usually will ask to find
So
out.
what is this book? Oh, I love that. I think I wonder if that's particularly strong in fantasy and science fiction, because so much is disguised as something else, and it might take a casual reader aback just how much is. I always have this argument about Terry Pratchett's Discworld, because there's so much. I adore Discworld, and there's so much in there, and people just don't expect it because they're just like, oh, it's just fantasy, and it's so much more than just a satire. So both of your books are set, well, actually, Louise, you're blatantly set in London. And Mike, you do have some elements of a landscape that we recognize in the books. How important do you think it is important that we as readers recognize bits of the landscape that you're describing, instead of just setting it in something where you absolutely have no idea where it is? Louise, do you want to take that one first?
It's a really good question. I think when I wrote the first draft of Inscape, London was much less identifiable. I mean, I think still clearly identifiable, but less so. And it wasn't until sort of the rewrite that my editor, Brendan, actually sort of suggested that I put in more landmarks, which is why sort of, so in the first draft, it was only really the Needle, which is the Shard. In the second draft, I added the Globe Theatre as like a sort of futuristic like techno brothel called the Rotunda. I put a big pink glass domed roof on it, but I had fun with that. So I think once Brendan made that suggestion to me, it made me realise that actually having those anchor points, having those sort of like points in the text where people would be able to read it and say like, hey, I recognise that, I know where we are. It makes it more. Well, for me, it made it more fun. Maybe that's a sort of slightly bizarre response, like, "Oh, I've wrecked London and I've made it all go to hell. This is extremely amusing." But I found it very fun to sort of to make it be sort of a different London, but still recognisably London ones.
I think, sorry, in the case of the Rampart books, I think one of the pleasures of post-apocalyptic fiction is transformation, is seeing familiar landscapes wearing unfamiliar dress. One of my favourite post-apocalypses is the Torture Quartet by Gene Wolfe, which is a sort of world which has our mythologies overlaid with centuries of distortions, and you're constantly seeing stories that you know being retold in slightly distorted ways. You know, the Coley books are a road trip from the north of England to London. And I think it is important that the places should be places that really exist. Just massively changed. There's a scene in the second book where Cody goes to Birmingham and ends up in the Birmingham ballroom, and I really enjoyed writing that actually. Most of the places in the trilogy are real, and they're sort of. I think it is important that they're anchored in that reality, because I think if you get the real world elements right, it makes the fantastic stuff that much more believable and more grounded.
I was going to say one of my favourite moments from the first Coley book is when Coley talks about the Parley men, the Parley Men and how they which is sort of like just a sort of wonderful recasting of Parliament, but also mixed with Arthurian legend, because he has the Parley Men all sitting around a round table where everybody is equal. I love that. Thought it was inspired.
Thank you.
Shocking. So we've already we've indicated you are part of a writing family. There's a lot of writing experience between the two of you now. Mike, do you mind just take us back to, do you remember when you started? Do you want to give us a quick, where did you start becoming a writer?
I was always, long before I started making a living as a writer, writing was always something that I did. When I was at school, I stole school exercise books. I'm not proud of this. Don't do this, kids. It's a gateway drug. And I would write fantasy novels that filled stacks and stacks of exercise books. I've still got some of them. When did I start thinking that writing might be something I could possibly do for a living? That was much later, and I came to it through I'm going to say journalism, but I'm going to use scare quotes. I used to write reviews and articles for fanzines, and I did that for ages, just for the fun of it. And then I started writing these so-called novels, which were not really novels; they were just big bags of story with no particular shape. Submitting those to publishers all through my 20s, and getting rejection slips that would say things like, "You should try writing this as a novel." But then a guy I knew who edited a fanzine became a comics editor. The fanzine was taken over by a comic distributor called Neptune, and he started his own little line of comics called Trident Comics. That was Martin Skidmore. Because I knew him, I pitched some ideas to him, and he accepted a couple of them. So I started writing comic scripts. I would have been about 30 at this point, and very much to my surprise, got some work commissioned. Spent a decade writing stuff for indie publishers before I sort of knocked on the door at DC, and that was when I wrote Lucifer. That was an overnight success in 10 years.
So when you were growing up, Louise, the fact that your dad was a published writer, was that something you were conscious of? This dad's going to work at his desk, he's just going to sit there all day staring at a piece of paper?
I mean, it was really nice for me, and I think for my brothers as well, because once Dad became a writer, he transitioned to working at home, which meant, there was always somebody to pick me up from school when I couldn't be bothered to walk the 15 minutes. But it definitely had an impact on me from an early age, because one thing Dad would do was, because when you started writing comics, it was still back in the days when they would fax you the black and white pages to go through and do corrections, and Dad would leave them lying around. So I think some of my early reading experiences were finding old sort of proof issues of Lucifer. I think the first one I read was a Lilith special issue where she talks about her womb being a garden where every seed planted would bear strange fruits. I think I was maybe 10, 11 when Dad came home from the shops one day and walked in on me reading this in avid fascination and was just like, put that down, Lou. So definitely a formative effect.
That is brilliant. So Lou, did you think, oh, this is what I want to do with my life? I want to write stories.
Yeah, from very early. I think you told this story better than me, Dad, but I think I remember a time when I was in reception, so sort of 5 or 6, and the teacher asked us all what we wanted to do when we grew up, and I said, I want to be a writer or an adventurer. And as I got older, I realized adventurer wasn't a real profession.
Well, yeah, maybe after the apocalypse.
Yeah, one day.
So, Mike, when Lou said to you she wants to be a writer, were you like, oh my God, no, I need someone in the family to have a proper job? Or were you like, that was my mother. I was like, well, I want to study writing. She's like, can you get a proper job? I work in publishing now, so I don't have a proper job is to write. What did you think when Lou was like, I want to be a writer?
I was fine with it. The big plan is that all three of our kids should become writers, and they should become bestsellers, and then we can retire and just live on merit. No, I think we've always been a family that's been kind of obsessed by story. Both Lynn, my wife, and myself did literature degrees at university, and we both, and Lynn is a novelist as well. But I think we just love storytelling, and it seemed entirely natural and organic for us to sort of move into that. Although it reassures me that she does a load of other stuff as well. The writing is not her own source of income. Hopefully, it will be at some point. Yeah, so I mean, we've collaborated on a few projects as well. Lou and I wrote a graphic novel together. Lou and Lynn and I wrote 2 novels together, which was
Yes, I want to ask about those.
it was actually a formative experience for me. It was
So yes, so before Louise, before you wrote Inscape and Outcast, which are your solo projects, you wrote 2 novels with your 2 parents.
Mhm.
How was that? I mean, was that harmonious?
For the most part.
I can turn him off if you want to be honest.
No, for the most part, much more harmonious than you might think. We wrote, so the first one was The Steel Seraglio, which came out in the UK as The City of Silk and Steel. And then after that, we wrote The House of War and Witness. I really enjoyed both those experiences, mostly because they involved a lot of working lunches. There was a lot of, which were more lunch than work. We would go out to our sort of our favorite sort of local Chinese restaurants and just stay there for a few hours, just talking about ideas and having a nice chat and eating some really good curries. So it was great.
And then we'd come home and one of us would type up the notes from the meeting very solemnly and then we'd do the same thing 2 weeks later or a month later or a couple of months later. We were never ever going to write that book until suddenly it was commissioned and we had a deadline. So
did you at that point?
Sorry.
Did you at that point spring into action and you wrote it all out?
Yeah, yes we did.
And who had that glorious job?
Well, Lou was crucial in that because we agreed that the first thing we had to do was to find a narrative voice that would work for all 3 of us. And Lou came up with a character named Ren, who wasn't in the original plan. She was a librarian who had been blessed or cursed by the 7 jinn, so that her tears were ink, and anything that was written in Ren's tears could never be effaced. It became completely indestructible. So we decided that we would write passages in Ren's voice and then read them aloud to each other and sort of discuss the tone, the inflections of the voice, and sort of converge on a narrative style that worked for all 3 of us. And it was you were kind of a catalyst for all of that.
Oh, that's kind of you to put it that way. I remember in the actual writing process, though, it was really very equal. We wrote pretty much even thirds of the book, you and me and Mum. And then afterwards, I think in some ways the really hard thing was after we had each written our third, which wasn't in order, I should add. We had a master spreadsheet, a very scary document that was color-coded with every single chapter and every single character who was sort of going to be narrating each chapter and what was going to happen in each chapter. And we spent a day poring over that spreadsheet and just picking the ones we liked best. And then we all wrote our chapters. And then the really hard work was then putting it all together, reading it all through and making sure it all sounded as if it had been written by one person rather than 3 quite different people.
Yeah. But it helped that it was sort of inspired by the Arabian Nights entertainment. So it was a story about stories. It was a story that had nested stories. It had digressions, and digressions had digressions that went even further from the main plot line. So there was a lot of room for different styles and different approaches. And Ren was sort of like the unifying element in all of that, which was something that we enjoyed so much that we did it again in House of War and Witness.
Yeah.
different setting, but a very similar sort of stylistic playfulness.
So has the spreadsheet approach survived either of your trilogy planning?
Actually,
Are you, Louise, are you still color coding your...
it's really funny you should ask, because yes, there's always been a spreadsheet for me ever since. And I hadn't even linked that to writing City and House until you asked the question. But yeah, like now normally the spreadsheets for me start in the editing phase now. I'll write the book and then I will get edit notes from, my beta readers and from Brendan and from my agent. And that's when the spreadsheet starts. I compile every single edit note I receive into a scary master document. And then I label them all from sort of easy to hard. And I give them all a priority number. And I use sort functions. It gives me a chance to stretch.
But you don't...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. When you plot your books, because they're both trilogies, did you plot them out?
I plotted
Mike,
them out.
did you plot?
I do.
Let's go with Lou, yeah.
I got into the habit when I was writing comics of doing very, very detailed plans for each issue, because if you only got 20 pages or 22 pages to tell your little chunk of story in, you've really got to be on top of it. You can't just sort of like wing it. And I carried that across into novels. But what I found with writing novels is that it doesn't matter how detailed the plan is, the novel always goes its own way. But the beauty of the plan is it's there when you need it. You will always wander away from it, but if you wander back, it's still there. It's a kind of spine, or it doesn't run at the centre of the structure and keeps the structure stable.
Because with Coley, that it's got such scale to it that I wouldn't even know where to start.
Well, Coley is sort of picaresque. There's I think that the two things you've got to have clear in your head when you start at the beginning and the ending. But there's a lot of stuff in the middle of the story, especially in the middle of a trilogy, that just happens because it happens. You have ideas along the way. There's this there's the sort of common the distinction that gets made between gardeners and builders. Those who do blueprints, or those who just sort of let the story accrete as it will. And I think the answer is most of us both. Most of us do a bit of planning, and most of us also pulled along by the story once the story has a certain amount of momentum, a certain amount of emphasis.
That's brilliant. Lou, were you always going to write 3 as your debut?
When I sort of first pitched the idea to my agent, I had it planned out as far as the first one. And then she said, "This sounds great. Will it be a trilogy?" But I said, "Yes, it will. Of course it will." And then I had to very quickly think of what was going to happen in the other 2. But now it sort of feels inevitable in a way. I think the story was always a little bit bigger than one book would have allowed for. So I think it was the right way of taking it.
That's also true for the Rampart trilogy. And the 3-part structure in the Coley books allows me to bring in a different narrative voice each time. So the first book is just Coley, the second book is Coley and Spinner, and the third is Coley and Spinner and A and other, which is a nice sort of like rolling snowball kind of thing.
And I have a similar thing in the Inscape trilogy, with the cast getting a little bigger every book. In Inscape, the most important characters are Tanta and Cole. Then in Outcast, we meet some new people. By the third one, which I have just recently finished writing, the cast was getting so big that I was sort of like, this might be more than I can handle.
Don't let them get away from you. Now, we're going to start looking at our audience questions. This is some very nice ones that have come in from Lena. I hope I'm saying that right. They have 4 questions, so we're gonna sparse them in. So, for Louise, do you have a favorite character that your dad has created?
Ooh, that's a great question. I actually really like the character of Coley, who's quite different from your usual protagonist, isn't he, Dad? He's a very sort of gentle, kind-hearted person, And that's what I like about him. And I think that's sort of, you can't say that of all your protagonists.
Most of my protagonists are bastards. Yeah, it's true. The male ones are.
You write an excellent bastard, but I love Carey because and also he's a pacifist. He's very, very non-violent. In a trilogy that has its share of violence and action, he's somebody who is committed to trying to find the peaceful solution. And I think that makes him a great character, but also it leads to some really great tension in the books because he's so often put into positions where what he wants to do is so different from what the situation kind of demands of him.
Yeah, he influences events mostly by being the conscience of the other characters. Most of the action scenes are dominated by the other characters, by Cup or by Ursula.
Yeah,
Mike, cool. I mean, you're the seasoned writer, but as you're reading Lou's work, is there bits where you're like, oh, I wish I had thought of that? That is so good. Why didn't I do that? Have you had that moment yet?
I've had that moment lots of times reading Inscape. Yeah, I think it's I'm reading the third one at the moment. Luke passed it along to the families who use it as beta readers. And what she was saying about the other characters coming into the spotlight. There's a character called Fliss. This is a spoiler. Just that we meet a character.
We'll keep it between us. It's
in
fine.
the second book. And in the third book, she really comes into her own. She's fantastic. I love the way the Tentacle relationship plays out, which I think is different from anything that I've done in any of my books. Thinking about the collaborations. Our first collaboration was on a comic book called Confessions of a Blabbermouth, and I was not a good collaborator at that point. I sort of felt, this is my 300th comic script. It's Lou's first comic script. She needs someone to tell her how this is done. So I would sort of I'd be leaning over her shoulder and saying, oh, you shouldn't do that. That's too much dialogue for one panel. Or that transition is a bit rough and ready. And at a certain point, she turned around and said to me, Dad, we have an editor on this book. Her name is Shelley Bond.
I don't remember being so devastating. That's a great line.
To back off. And when I finished being pissed off about that, I was really proud.
Oh, brilliant.
Louise herself, she's not at all like me in the way she writes, I think. And there are constant surprises, and they're always good surprises.
Speaking of surprises, now I know you as a family play RPGs together, role play games. Do you feel that has really helped you shape your writing or your imagination or your storytelling? Do you enjoy? And who's the boss actually? Who DMs?
I usually DM. And sometimes my partner Cam also DMs, which of course because we ran some games for Chimera back in 2020.
You did, and they're still on our YouTube channel. I highly encourage all of you out there to go and check out our recorded RPGs. They're amazing. They're so much fun. Just bring time with you. So do you mind when Lou DMs you, Mike?
No,
do you kind DM?
I wouldn't dream of DM. I used to DM in my 20s, my late teens and 20s, but it was incredible. It was incredibly exciting to discover how much the game's changed since the 1970s. Back when I used to play as a student, it was all about gathering loot and experience points and killing a bunch of NPCs. And then I discovered when Lou and Cam started DMing, when I joined their games, I discovered these days it's about owning a shared narrative. It's about a story coming together, being created by the group and curated by the DM. And it's a wonderful sort of approach to storytelling. I've really missed it this year because we did a lot in the first year of lockdown. We haven't done it much in the second year. I don't think it's necessarily reflective of my own writing. It's definitely given me a sort of hunger for collaborative gameplay, which I think is becoming a much bigger thing.
Yeah, we've got a question from Lena actually, who's asking if you play any video games, like MMORPGs.
Oh, Yes, I never
Yeah.
did before I met my my partner Camden. I'd never really played any video games except sort of like I used to have like the Harry Potter PC games when I was a kid, and that was about, and the Sims, and that was the extent of it. But then I met Camden, and he introduced me to Mass Effect and Dragon Age, which are just my absolute favorites, and I can't praise them highly enough. And now, you know, whenever I can get anyone to listen, I will deliver a little lecture on how, like, video games can be amazing storytelling mediums, and you can have such sort of epic, moving, inspiring tales, and like, yeah. So those are my favorites. But I'm still sort of, it's a world I'm still kind of discovering.
I actually hit game writing and bounce. I've done a little bit of it here and there, most notably in the X-Men Destiny game. But I can't do it. I can't. The sort of the degrees of freedom the story has to have, being able to sort of like keep a structure going, but allowing characters to make choices that inflect the story at each stage, it is really difficult. And I've got nothing but admiration for the writers who do it.
Definitely. So when you're playing your RPGs, do you have a go-to character? What's your standard kind of, I'm gonna be this kind of character, or do you like to go completely off, like completely something nobody would?
We've had several. So we've normally had at any one time we've had a Louise campaign and a Camden campaign going, and Lou plays in Camden's games and Cam plays in Lou's games. I'm currently both a gigantic, like 7-foot tall, war-forged battle golem, and I'm a sneak thief, a tiefling sneak thief named Kimia, who is sort of proud of her demonic heritage and dreams of having wings. But it's we invent different characters for each game. It's part of the fun, I think. That kind of narrative cross-dressing is really exciting.
Oh, I love that narrative cross-dressing. Lou, what's your narrative cross-dressing?
Actually, I play my most current character is a sort of a monk called Gerard, after Gerard Manley Hopkins, who is about as unlike me as it's possible to be. He's incredibly athletic, bare knuckle fighter.
Interestingly, Gerald Manley Hopkins is also the source of the title Inscape, isn't it?
Oh, that's true. Wow, yeah, big influence, I guess.
I love it. I do love an RPG. We always have Apps, who's also just joined us in the chat, who's put the link for the RPG from this year in. They are just so much fun. They are so much fun. Now, I've got another question from Lena. Keep them coming, which is also for Lou. Aside from your dad, who's your favorite author or your favorite book?
Ooh, that's such a difficult question, because there are so many. There are so many. I feel like it's very difficult to give one answer. But one that's in my head right now, so I will throw it out, is I really, really like, I really, really like Frances Harding, the children's author. Her novels are just really, really magical, and kind of they felt really groundbreaking to me. I mean, obviously I only came to her as an adult, but I think that there is such a lot of like complexity and emotional nuance in what she writes, and I'd especially recommend Cuckoo Song and Deep Light.
Cuckoo Song is a masterpiece. It's
nice.
Breathtaking.
Mike, who's your favorite author?
As with Lou, I think there are so many different answers to that. It depends how you catch it on a given day. One of my favorites is Gene Wolfe. I think the Torture Quartet is a wonderful work, but also Tan and the Eagle, the Baslag novels, City in the City, The Census Taker. I just revel in his prose style. He's such a gorgeously cheery writer, and every book is different. Ursula Le Guin is another favourite.
Amazing.
I discovered her when I was still at school, reading the Assi novels, and I discovered the Epimen cycle, and I've grown up So there's never been a time where I haven't been reading it. Currently, Louise is reading me and Lynn Lavinia, the novel that Lynn wrote about based on the Aeneid, in which one of the characters from the Aeneid gets to meet Virgil, gets to meet a literary creator and talk back to him. Just a gorgeous book. It's absolutely amazing.
And since we've talked so much about dystopian fiction, we should probably also shout out Jasper Ford's Shades of Grey.
Yes.
That's like Shades of Grey, by the way, not 50 Shades of Grey, and it was written before it, and it's very frustrating that the names are so similar. But that's just, it's got to be one of my favorite dystopias of all time, because it's just so bizarre and so utterly unlike any other dystopian fiction I've ever read before.
And I love that the apocalypse in Shades of Grey is called the something that happened. It's so long ago, nobody really remembers what it was. They still have a sort of trauma, but they can't articulate what the trauma is based on.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I don't think I've ever read anything else that sort of, it's a society where everybody only sees one color, and it's hierarchically segregated by what color you can see. So at the bottom of the social hierarchy are the greys, who see no colors at all, and then it's the greens and the blues, and at the top are the reds. It's just wild.
So clever.
Can't recommend it.
I loved his most recent one, where what if we hibernated?
I just finished that.
It's like, what would the world look like if we hibernated for half of the year?
Brilliant.
And it's just he's so fantastic. Absolutely good. Absolutely good. That's terrible. Okay. I have a great question from Neil. As writers, you have done so much. How do you switch off? Or do you always have a pad nearby to keep ideas?
I do always have a pad, a pad or a screen, something to type or scribble on. And I sometimes go over the old books as well, the old pads. I've got a stack of pads. If I'm looking for inspiration, I'll sort of pick one up from 10 years ago and then flick through to see ideas that I didn't follow up. Switching off. I spend an awful lot of time reading and watching TV, or watching TV drama, or watching movies. Stories are how I relax, as well as how I earn my keep. So in a sense, I never switch off.
Yeah.
You're the same, Lou.
Yeah, it's the same for me, only rather than a notebook, I've got the notes app on my phone. I've seen so many people on Twitter sort of bewailing that idea that you have in a dream, and then you're certain that you'll remember it, so you don't write it down, but then you forget it. But now, if I have that dream, I write it down immediately. I wake myself up and I write it down. The problem is I often don't understand what I've written the next day. I'll look at my app and it will be like, just sort of like the Council of Crows and then 10 exclamation marks. So I'll be like, well, clearly I was very excited about this at 3 a.m., but now I have no idea what I was talking about.
I don't have dreams like that. It's really annoying. Before I was a writer, before I was sort of a writer as a job, I was a teacher for I guess about 15 or 20 years, and my dreams are still teaching anxiety dreams. They're always dreams where I go into a classroom unprepared, or I'm running towards a lesson, but it's late and I lose my way, and then my briefcase falls open and the notes spill everywhere.
That's horrible.
I know.
For me, it's sitting final exams, except the paper's in Russian.
That is shocking. Okay, we've got so many more good questions, but we're not going to get to all of them, so I apologize in advance. So we're going to close with, if you both could choose one item to help you survive the dystopia in your novels, what would it be? Right. Louise, do you want to take that first?
Such a good question, but I'm not sure if I have a good answer. Man, okay. I suppose.
Of course, it will have to be spoiler free as well.
Yeah, this is where I'm struggling.
Right, Mike, have you got one?
I'm gonna go with don't pet the plants.
Oh, I thought it was an item, right?
Oh, an item.
Yes, an item. Yeah.
Nice. An item. Yep. Pesticide.
Oh,
that's a very good.
Of course, a pesticide.
Yeah, I suppose, by the same token, I could maybe say some sort of like pocket-sized EMP device to disrupt sort of networks and signals.
Oh, very Matrix, very like
Tell these well.
brilliant. So as my closing question, now, Lou, you've already said you have just finished book 3. Are you taking a little break? Or you got your next project lined up?
Next project is sort of in the process of being hashed out at the moment. I took a little break over Christmas. Yeah.
Wow, a whole 2 weeks.
Yes, more
Okay.
details soon, I hope.
That's exciting. When are we expecting book 3 to be out? Later this year?
Book 3 will be out same time next year, so January
Oh, of course,
of 23.
January. Amazing.
Sorry,
Sorry, you all
out
have to wait.
tomorrow.
Yes. So you've got 2 books to catch up, and then you've just got to wait a year. Still quicker than J.R.R. Martin. And Mike, what are you doing now that you've finished the trilogy?
So I wrote a book last year called I Will Tell You 7, which is it's a horror novel based on the Seven Samurai or the Magnificent Seven. It's like what if the Magnificent Seven were undead? But also I'm working on a big dimension crossing sci-fi novel, which might very well come out before that one.
Okay. That sounds amazing. Well, I'm already very excited to see what you bring out next. Fortunately for all of us, we have lots of other things to read before then. So I encourage you all to seek out Inscape and Outcast and the Rampart trilogy if you haven't read them yet. Or, indeed that book that the 3 of them wrote. If you go to Lou's website, it is listed on there. You can find it there. Pick it up from your indie bookshop of your choice or the internet, Broken Binding or bookshop.org. Go and find the stories and enjoy them. And please join me in thanking Louise and Mike Carey for a brilliant hour. Thank you so much for chatting to me. And have a wonderful night, everyone. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank
Bye,
you so much
everyone.
for coming, everybody. Bye.
Bye. I'm going to shut you off now. Go have dinner. Bye.
Good night.